Okay, let's dive right into a fascinating set of source material today.
Yeah, we're exploring how, according to this one particular source, the world seems to be reacting to some major shifts in global dynamics.
And specifically, how the United States is, well, being perceived right now on the international stage, at least through the lens of this source.
Right.
The source we're digging into for this deep dive, just so you know, is a transcript. It's from a YouTube video channel called Midas Touch, and the title is World Leaders Give Death Blow to Trump Who Hides in Shame.
And it's really important we frame this source right up front. It presents a very, very specific viewpoint.
Definitely.
It's interpreting actions by various international players, countries, leaders as direct responses to recent U.S. actions and leadership.
So our mission here.
Our mission, exactly, is to unpack the specific examples and claims made within this source. We want to understand the core points it's trying to make about this perceived global reaction.
So why spend time on this particular deep dive? Why should you care?
Well, the reactions highlighted in this source, whether you agree with the interpretation or not, they point to potential shifts.
Shifts in international relationships, how the U.S. is seen globally.
Exactly. And these are changes that could impact, trade, diplomacy, global stability.
Things that eventually ripple outwards and can affect all of us.
Precisely.
All right, let's unpack what this source actually puts forward then. So the central argument this source lays out right at the top, it's pretty stark, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It claims world leaders smell how weak and pathetic someone is perceived to be.
And that they're actively capitalizing on America's downfall caused by a regime's recklessness, maliciousness, and just utter negligence. That's a direct quote.
That language, yeah, it clearly establishes the source's main thesis from the get-go.
No punches pulled there.
None at all. And from there, it immediately starts offering specific examples it claims support this argument, starting particularly with Europe and Canada.
Okay, Europe first. Example one the source highlights is France. It points to President Emmanuel Macron.
Right, suggesting he's deliberately projecting to the world that France and the EU should be leading, acting as a, quote, stabilizing force.
Especially around things like free trade.
Yeah, and the source really zeroes in on Macron's actions, but also the timing.
The timing, how so?
It notes this meeting he had with the South African delegation right away. That's the phrase used after a separate meeting involving South Africa's president had taken place in the Oval Office.
Ah, okay. And the source has some thoughts on that Oval Office meeting.
It does. It uses extremely strong, very colorful language to describe it. Things like disgusting gold bordello of filth.
Wow.
And claims it involved discussion of deranged white genocide conspiracies.
Okay, that's quite the description.
It is. And the source emphasizes that immediately after that meeting, Macron met the South Africans.
To talk about
Dynamic trade, according to the source, and to reaffirm support for South Africa hosting the G20. The implication clearly is a deliberate contrast.
And the source sees Macron making an even more pointed statement, maybe a coded one, during his tour in Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore.
That's right. The video transcript analyzes Macron's language while he was in Hanoi, Vietnam.
What kind of language?
It highlights his emphasis on things like cooperation, a common future, building together, respecting sovereignty, building bridges.
Standard diplomatic talk, maybe?
Perhaps, but the source interprets it differently. It describes France as a power of peace and balance and a reliable partner.
And the source's take is
that this specific phrasing is a deliberate, quote, implied way of saying America's over, French and the European Union are here to stay. That's the interpretation presented.
Okay, so that's France. Shifting from France specifically to the EU more broadly, the source brings up tariffs.
Ah, yes, the tariffs. And this is where the source presents a pretty remarkable interpretation of negotiation dynamics.
Remarkable how? What's the claim?
The source claims that the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, managed to get a threat to impose 50% tariffs on Europe by June 1st removed.
Okay.
In one phone call with someone. That's the claim. According to the source, all she had to do was ask for an extension to July 9th.
I know it's granted. Just like that.
It was granted, according to the source.
And the source uses some strong language to characterize this interaction.
Incredibly strong. It calls it a capitulation, flat out.
Okay.
It states that the person caves over and over again. It even quotes a statement saying it was a privilege to grant the extension.
A privilege. Interesting phrasing.
And the source quotes its own editor directly, calling it a surrender again while declaring victory. describing the whole thing as utterly embarrassing and pathetic.
So clearly, the source sees this specific interaction and the language used around it as really strong evidence for its main thesis.
Absolutely. Evidence as they present it that perceived weakness is leading to major concessions on the international stage.
Okay, so we've seen the source claim recalibration in Europe, both France and the EU. Does this pattern hold elsewhere, according to them? Let's look north. Canada.
Yeah, Canada's next. The source claims, first, that tourism from the EU to the U.S. is tanking.
Tanking. Oh.
And that Canada led the way in initiating a tourism boycott and boycott on all American products.
A boycott led by Canada. That's a strong claim.
It is. And the source connects these economic points to broader shifts. It includes statements from Canadian Prime Minister Carney.
Right, specifically about addressing large online platforms.
Exactly. The source quotes Carney saying, large American online platforms have become seas of racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and hate.
Strong words again.
Very. And he's quoted saying his government will act against them, even referencing platforms like Elon Musk's X and Twitter.
So the interpretation here is Canada taking independent action, even on issues involving big U.S. tech companies.
That seems to be the point the video is making, yes. Showing Canada charting its own course on significant social and regulatory issues.
And then there's the symbolism. This is where, according to the source, it gets really interesting with King Charles.
Ah, yes, King Charles giving the speech from the throne in Canada. This event is highlighted quite significantly in the source.
How so?
Well, it includes an interview with a former Canadian MP, Charlie Angus. And they frame this event as a, quote, big kind of foo.
A foo. Directed at
someone in the U.S. is the implication. And it's also framed as a symbolic re-emphasis of the Commonwealth links Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand.
So Canada deliberately turning to the UK and Commonwealth allies more strongly now.
That's the interpretation presented by the source and Mr. Angus in the video, yes.
And the source notes the timing is significant too. First time since 77.
Right. First time the monarch has done this in Canada since Queen Elizabeth in 1977. Adds symbolic weight, according to them.
The source also throws in some speculation about someone in the U.S. having a weird kind of king fetish.
It does mention that, yeah, as part of the sort of perceived messaging around the whole event.
Okay. But the core symbolism.
The core symbolism, as explained by the source and Mr. Angus, is that while maybe most Canadians are usually indifferent to the monarchy.
Right, not typically a huge daily focus.
Exactly. But in this moment, the symbolism is presented as hugely important.
Why now?
It's described as saying to the world that Canada is part of the Commonwealth, that they are looking much more now to the UK, and crucially, the source points out, quoting Angus, that Canada would normally not really want a king to come.
Ah, so the fact they are doing it now is the message.
Precisely. Interpreted by the source as a deliberate signal of recalibrating their primary relationship away from Washington.
And the source also emphasizes Canada's perspective on shared values, or the lack thereof right now.
Yes. Mr. Angus, speaking in the video transcript, draws a very sharp contrast.
What does he say?
He states Canada is a democratic nation, believes in the rule of law, while his view, as presented, is that the U.S. has allowed a man who attempted a coup to stay in power. And he goes on to say, again, according to Angus in the source, that the U.S. Supreme Court says this person is above and beyond the rule of law, calling this the action of an oligarch.
Very strong language attributed to the former MP there.
Extremely strong. And the source adds another claim, too.
Which is?
That someone's attacks on Canada are, quote, about 100 to 1 compared to negative things said about Putin.
100 to 1. That's specific.
It is. And Mr. Angus, in the source, finishes with a pointed message for U.S. regions affected by trade issues, like Dakota's farmers.
Telling them
to, quote, deal with the felon in charge from Mar-a-Lago instead of coming to Canada for help.
Wow. Okay. So again, the source uses this interview to present a really forceful viewpoint.
Absolutely. Using specific charged language attributed to Mr. Angus to highlight what it sees as a significant shift in how Canada views the U.S. relationship based on perceived values and leadership.
Let's shift our focus now to Asia. The source provides more examples from that region too, right?
It does. Vietnam, for instance.
What's the claim about Vietnam?
The source claims Vietnam is actually violating its own laws to approve a massive project, a $1.5 billion golf complex and skyscraper.
For whom?
For someone in the U.S. located in Ho Chi Minh City. And the source adds it potentially involves bulldozing family burial plots.
That sounds problematic. How does the source interpret this?
It frames it as a tragic story, but interprets Vietnam's actions allegedly breaking its own laws as seeing this specific project as a way to potentially negotiate their tariffs favorably with someone in the U.S.
So another example presented by the source of a country adapting its approach, engaging with perceived personal business interests as a foreign policy tool.
That seems to be exactly the interpretation the source is putting forward.
Okay. What else in Asia? The source mentions China.
Yes, briefly, it mentions China hosting a conference of Latin American and Caribbean countries.
And the significance of that, according to the source?
It frames this as China projecting itself as a stabilizing force in a region, traditionally seen as strongly within the U.S. sphere of influence.
Another global power stepping into a perceived vacuum, perhaps.
Or at least working to shift its sphere of influence. That's the analysis presented in this source, yes.
Got it. And India is also brought into the discussion.
India too, yes. The source claims India is, quote, furious at the Trump regime.
Furious, why?
And that it's actively pursuing trade deals with Europe and other countries specifically to, quote, protect itself from Donald Trump's threats.
Protecting itself via trade deals. Any specific examples given?
The source points to Apple and its manufacturers continuing to build and expand in India, despite threats mentioned in the source to build in the U.S. instead.
Ah, okay. So the conclusion the source draws from that is
that someone's threats are now seen internationally as, quote, empty, like the boy who cried wolf, lacking the real weight or impact they might have once carried. Again, that's the source's interpretation.
understood. Now, the source also turns its attention to Russia and Ukraine.
It does, claiming that Putin sees the utter weakness in someone.
And the evidence presented for that claim.
The source highlights a particularly significant missile strike on Ukraine, describes it as the biggest ballistic missile strike and drone strike and missile strike yet, aimed at Kyiv.
Okay, a major attack. But the link.
The source draws a direct connection with the timing. It claims this happened around Kyiv Day and, critically, just days after someone in the U.S. reportedly spoke to Putin.
The timing again. Proximate to a phone call.
Exactly. And the source presents this timing, along with someone's reported reaction.
What was the reaction?
Quoting them as saying, I want him to stop. It's really making me angry. The source presents this reaction as evidence of perceived weakness.
Especially when contrasted with
how the source claims this person has behaved towards other leaders in the past, implying a different, weaker response now.
And the source makes a strong assertion about that phone call itself.
A very strong one. The source's claim is that the conversation with Putin the previous week involved capitulating and effectively giving Putin a green light for these strikes.
A green light. That's a serious claim.
It is. And the source adds, for context, that someone reportedly hadn't even spoken to Chinese President Xi Jinping around that time.
Okay, that's a powerful set of specific examples the source uses to build its case. How does it try to tie this all together?
Well, near the end, the source includes a pretty significant observation from historian Timothy Snyder.
From a Council on Foreign Relations event, right? Offering a broader analysis.
Exactly. It's presented as a way to put these international reactions into a larger context, looking at the situation within the U.S.
What's Snyder's point as presented in the source?
The source highlights Snyder arguing that the U.S. is doing something different from what Russia did under Putin, for example.
Different how?
According to Snyder, as presented in the source, the U.S. is simultaneously making the state less functional domestically.
Less functional. Like
he mentions basic things, building roads, ensuring airplanes don't crash, preventing outbreaks of diseases like measles, that kind of core state function.
Okay, so less functional domestically.
While at the same time making the organs of repression, his words, much more ostentatious and visible.
Less functional state services, but more visible repression. That's a striking combination presented there.
It is. And Snyder, according to the video transcript, contrasts this specific combination with Russian leaders.
How so?
He argues that even when the Russian state might have been less functional in some ways, its leaders were generally much more careful about trying to present the state as being functional.
Trying to keep up appearances of competence, even if flawed.
Right. A caution that Snyder, in the source is telling, believes Putin still exercises now.
So what's the conclusion Snyder draws from this unique U.S. combination, according to the source?
The source presents Snyder concluding that this particular mix, decreasing domestic function paired with visibly increased repression, raises a possibility that maybe we haven't talked about much before.
Which is?
The possibility, according to Snyder in the source, of the American system buckling, a potential failure, essentially, of the federal government itself.
Wow. Buckling.
Now,
That's
and the source emphasizes Snyder's belief, as quoted, that this specific scenario is something which is possible here, which didn't happen in Russia, a unique potential vulnerability.
so, okay, pulling back from all these specific examples, France, EU, Canada, Vietnam, India, China, Russia, Ukraine, and this broader Snyder analysis presented.
Yeah.
What's the overall picture this source paints?
Well, it paints a picture, according to this source, it's crucial to keep stressing that of a world reacting.
Reacting how?
Reacting strongly to perceived shifts in U.S. global influence, its reliability, its values, and maybe even its internal stability. We see examples presented of other nations pursuing their own interests more assertively, maybe forming different alliances or engaging differently based on these perceptions.
Right. It's not just isolated incidents, in the source's view.
Exactly. The source argues these aren't just, random diplomatic spats or trade disagreements. They're presented as symptoms.
Symptoms of a larger change in the international order, and potentially, as the Snyder analysis suggests, tied to the internal condition of the U.S. itself.
That's the connection the source makes. It suggests other global powers are stepping up, or they're recalibrating key relationships, perhaps exploiting perceived weaknesses.
While the U.S., as analyzed by Snyder in the source, faces this seemingly unique challenge, simultaneous domestic decay in core functions, and increased visibility of state power or repression.
That's the picture constructed within this particular video transcript.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to consider as you reflect on all this.
Yeah, something to mull over.
If, and it's a big if based on this one source's claims, but if the U.S. system is potentially becoming less functional internally, while being perceived fundamentally differently externally.
How might that fundamentally change how other countries interact with it in the long run?
Right, way beyond just negotiating the next trade deal or managing the next diplomatic spat. What could the deeper, longer-term shifts in global interaction look like?